Ethan Carter had always believed that silence was a kind of language, one that revealed truths people rarely dared to speak. The quiet, dense forest that surrounded the new research base felt like a continuation of that belief. It was peaceful, but it held secrets. When he and his partner Clara moved to the edge of the wildlife preserve, he thought it would be a fresh beginning, a chance to mend what routine and distance had quietly damaged between them. But beginnings, he was learning, had a way of testing what was already fragile. Clara noticed the shift before Ethan did. The way his attention drifted during breakfast, the way he stared out at the misty horizon longer than necessary, as if waiting for something to appear. She tried to fill the silence with conversation, stories about the house, the neighbors, the endless unpacking, but his responses came slower each day. He wasn't cold, just absent, like someone walking through FOGE.at the research facility. Ethan found himself absorbed in a new assignment, an environmental study focused on the migratory behavior of forest mammals. It was the kind of work that demanded patience and observation, both qualities he possessed in abundance. When the project coordinator introduced a new field assistant, a volunteer from an environmental NGO in Kenya, Ethan hardly looked up at first. But when Malik Kato entered the room, something about the man's calm presence caught his attention. Malik was unlike anyone Ethan had worked with before. He was confident but not loud, his movements deliberate, his smile easy yet restrained. There was a steadiness about him that seemed to quiet the noise around him. During the briefing, he listened more than he spoke, nodding thoughtfully as though every detail carried weight. When their eyes met briefly across the table, Ethan felt something unspoken pass between them, a faint recognition, not of familiarity, but of intrigue. Over the next week, their paths crossed often. Malik assisted with data collection, sometimes joining Ethan in the lab to review samples or note field results. Their conversations began formally, technical, precise, but gradually drifted into personal territory. Malik spoke of his homeland, of dry seasons and green valleys, of how nature taught him patience. Ethan, in turn, found himself sharing small details about his own life, his love for the rain, his unease with crowds, his habit of collecting old maps. Clara noticed that he returned home later each evening. When she asked if the workload was heavy, Ethan simply nodded, adding that Malik was efficient and that the team's progress depended on long hours. She smiled politely but watched his face as he spoke, sensing that something had changed beneath his calm surface. The first real sign came a week later, during a team meeting. The institute announced an upcoming field assessment, a 3-day survival and observation exercise deep inside the jungle. 2-person teams would venture out to test their endurance and record nocturnal animal activity. Ethan volunteered immediately, surprising even himself with how quickly he raised his hand. When the coordinator asked for his chosen partner, he said Malik's name without hesitation. Later that night, Clara asked why he hadn't picked one of his longtime colleagues. Ethan shrugged. Malik's reliable. He's good in the field, he said, though even to himself, the words felt rehearsed. She said nothing more, only reached across the table to squeeze his hand. Her touch was warm, familiar, yet something inside him stayed distant, unreachable. In the days leading up to the expedition, Ethan felt an unfamiliar restlessness. He told himself it was the anticipation of the fieldwork, the challenge of navigating wild terrain. But beneath that reasoning pulsed a quieter truth, curiosity. He wanted to understand Malik beyond the polite exchanges and professional boundaries. There was a depth to him, a quiet confidence that drew Ethan closer, not through words but through presence. The morning of departure arrived with a mist that hung low over the trees. Clara helped him pack, folding his clothes neatly, slipping a small note into the side pocket of his bag. "For when you can't sleep," she said with a faint smile. Ethan kissed her forehead, thanked her softly, and promised to call once they returned. She watched from the porch as he loaded his gear into the truck, her hand raised in a wave that lingered long after he disappeared down the dirt road. The drive to the jungle was long, winding through narrow paths and forgotten villages. Malik sat beside him, occasionally pointing out a tree species or the tracks of a wild animal in the dust. Their conversation was sparse but comfortable. There was a rhythm between them, built not from familiarity but from a shared understanding of solitude. By the time they reached the forest base, the sun had dipped low, staining the sky in shades of gold and crimson. They unloaded their supplies, checked their equipment, and set up camp by a small river clearing. The sound of flowing water mingled with the distant calls of unseen creatures. Malik gathered wood for the fire while Ethan assembled the tent, their movements wordless yet synchronized. As the flames rose, Malik sat across from Ethan, his face illuminated by the orange light. He began to speak about his childhood, the sound of drums on nights of celebration, the scent of rain on dry earth. His voice carried warmth, unhurried, almost melodic. Ethan listened, drawn in by the simple honesty of it. When Malik asked about his life, Ethan hesitated before answering. He spoke of his city, his studies, his relationship with Clara, but his words felt thin, as if describing someone else's existence. The night deepened, the forest alive with whispers. A silence stretched between them, neither heavy nor awkward, just present. Malik looked into the fire, then at Ethan. "Sometimes," he said softly, "we go far to find what we were afraid to see close to home." Ethan didn't reply. The words lingered in his mind long after Malik turned away. He thought of Clara, of their quiet dinners, their unspoken distance, and wondered what he was truly searching for in this place. The forest around them seemed to pulse with unseen life. Crickets hummed, the river murmured, and the fire crackled in small bursts. Ethan felt both alone and understood in a way he couldn't name. It wasn't attraction he felt, not yet, but recognition, as though Malik's presence mirrored something hidden within himself. When he finally lay down inside the tent, the night air cool against his skin, he could still hear Malik moving outside, humming a faint tune in his native tongue. The melody faded slowly, leaving Ethan awake with thoughts that refused to quiet. Tomorrow, they would begin their test, 3 days alone in the wilderness. But even now, Ethan sensed that what awaited them wasn't merely a test of survival. It would be something deeper, quieter, and far more revealing. That he closed his eyes, listening to the forest breathe. The silence, once familiar, now carried a question he wasn't sure he wanted answered. The morning arrived gray and humid, the forest still heavy with the scent of rain. Ethan woke to the rustling of leaves and the low hum of insects beyond the tent walls. Malik was already outside, crouched by the stream, washing his face in the cold water. For a moment, Ethan simply watched him, the steadiness of his movements, the quiet focus that seemed to ground everything around him. There was no rush, no noise, only presence. They packed their supplies in silence and began their first trek deeper into the jungle. The canopy above filtered the sunlight into shifting patterns of gold and green. Every few steps, Malik stopped to mark animal prints in the damp soil, noting direction and distance. Ethan followed, recording data, though his mind was elsewhere. There was a rhythm to Malik's voice when he spoke about the land, an almost sacred respect that made the forest feel alive, like a living companion rather than an environment. By midday, the heat pressed down on them. They paused under a broad-leaved tree, sharing dried fruit and water. Malik leaned against the trunk, eyes scanning the horizon. "The jungle doesn't hide things," he said. "It reveals them slowly. You just have to stay long enough to see what's really there." Ethan nodded, unsure whether Malik spoke about nature or something else entirely. As the day wore on, they crossed a shallow ravine, waded through knee-deep mud, and set up camp on slightly higher ground before sunset. Ethan lit the fire while Malik arranged their equipment. The first night was quiet, except for the forest's constant chorus. Ethan wrote his notes by the firelight, his handwriting slower, less precise than usual. Malik sat nearby, sharpening a small knife, his face half-lit by the flames. "Why environmental work?" Malik asked suddenly. "You could be in a city, teaching, researching, comfortable." Ethan hesitated. "Because comfort doesn't mean peace," he said. "And sometimes peace isn't where you expect to find it." Malik looked at him thoughtfully but said nothing more. The fire crackled softly between them, and for a moment Ethan wished he understood the silence they shared, what it meant, what it was asking of him. That night, rain came without warning. The forest transformed into a restless body, every drop echoing against the leaves. The tent shuddered in the wind, and a branch crashed nearby, startling them both awake. Ethan reached for the lantern, its light flickering weakly as Malik checked the ropes outside. When Malik returned, soaked to the skin, their eyes met, both aware of the vulnerability of their situation. They spent the rest of the night sitting upright, speaking in low tones to keep themselves awake. Malik told stories from his childhood, how his mother taught him to read animal signs, how his father once got lost for 2 days in the bush and came back changed. Ethan listened closely, drawn to the honesty in Malik's voice. When dawn finally broke, the rain stopped, leaving behind a soft mist. They set out again, the air thick and fragrant. It was then that Ethan realized they had veered off course. The map no longer matched the terrain, and the GPS flickered uselessly. Malik took the lead, reading the forest with instinct rather than instruments. Hours passed with no sign of the main route. The uncertainty didn't scare Ethan, instead, it stirred something unfamiliar. Trust.by evening, exhaustion set in. They decided to stop near a fallen tree where the ground was dry enough for a small fire. Malik gathered branches while Ethan unpacked food supplies. The forest darkened quickly, the sounds of night growing closer, owls, insects, the distant cry of something unseen. When Malik sat beside him, their shoulders nearly touching, the proximity felt heavier than the silence. "You trust me, don't you?" Malik asked quietly. Ethan looked up, caught off guard. "I do," he said after a pause. "More than I expected." Malik nodded, his expression unreadable. "Then you'll be fine. Fear doesn't belong here." They ate in silence, the fire between them shrinking into embers. Ethan found himself studying Malik's face, the lines of concentration, the calm that seemed unshakable even in uncertainty. It wasn't attraction in the ordinary sense, it was recognition. Malik carried something Ethan had long lost, a steadiness untouched by pretense. Later, when the wind turned cold, they moved closer to the fire. Ethan felt the weight of the day settle in his chest. "You ever think," he said slowly, "that maybe we meet certain people just to see ourselves more clearly?" Malik smiled faintly. "Sometimes that's exactly why we meet them." The words hung there, neither answered nor dismissed. Ethan turned toward the fire, watching the glow reflect in Malik's eyes. In that moment, he understood that something inside him had shifted, not an action, not a betrayal, but a quiet fracture in certainty. The night grew colder. Without speaking, they shared the blanket Ethan had brought, sitting shoulder to shoulder. The contact was simple, practical, yet charged with awareness. Malik's breathing was steady, grounding. Ethan closed his eyes, letting the closeness steady him. There was no need for words, no gesture beyond what necessity allowed. But the air between them carried a truth both men understood and neither dared to name. When Ethan finally drifted into sleep, it was shallow and uneasy. He dreamed of water, vast, still, and endless, and a voice telling him that tests are not about endurance, but about truth. The following morning, they retraced their steps, finally finding familiar markers along the path. Relief flickered across Malik's face, though he said little. As they walked, Ethan felt the strange ache of knowing the journey was nearing its end. What had begun as an assignment had become something else entirely, a quiet confrontation with who he was beneath the layers of certainty. By midday, the forest began to thin, sunlight spilling through the gaps in the canopy. Malik stopped to drink from the stream, then looked back at Ethan. "You're different," he said simply. "Maybe," Ethan replied. "Or maybe I just stopped pretending I'm not." Malik smiled faintly, not in amusement but in recognition. "The jungle shows people to themselves. It's what it does best." Ethan nodded, feeling the weight of the words. Neither man said anything more as they continued toward the clearing. The air smelled of wet leaves and new beginnings. When the trees finally broke open to reveal the wide expanse of sky, Ethan paused, looking back once at the path they had taken. It seemed impossible that so much could change in so few miles. Malik stood beside him, quiet, his expression unreadable. The camp was still several hours away, but Ethan no longer cared about time. What mattered wasn't the data they had gathered or the miles they had covered, it was what the silence between them had revealed. As they walked on, the jungle's hum faded behind them, replaced by the faint sound of human voices from the distant base. Ethan glanced at Malik, wanting to speak but unsure of what words could capture what had passed between them. Malik caught his gaze and said softly, "Some tests end when you find your way back. Others start when you do." Ethan didn't respond. He only nodded, feeling both understood and unsettled. Ahead, the path widened toward the camp. Behind them, the forest breathed quietly, keeping its secrets. The sky had already turned the color of steel when Ethan Carter stepped off the bus. The wind carried the salt of the sea and the faint cry of gulls, both distant and constant, like a whisper reminding him how far he was from home. His father's voice still echoed in his mind, calm, commanding, final, "You'll stay with Michael Reed for a while. You can learn a thing or two from him." Ethan didn't argue. He rarely did. His father, Robert Carter, was a man whose decisions left no room for discussion. The idea of staying with his father's old friend, someone he barely remembered from childhood, had filled Ethan with quiet dread. Yet now, as the sprawling coastline stretched before him and the house appeared at the end of a winding road, curiosity replaced hesitation. The house was larger than he expected, its wooden exterior faded but dignified, like something from an old photograph that refused to lose its color. A single light glowed from the window, soft and golden against the gray evening. When Michael Reed opened the door, Ethan felt both relief and uncertainty. "Ethan Carter," Michael said, his voice carrying a warmth that didn't feel rehearsed. "I haven't seen you since you were, 10, maybe 11. Ethan smiled faintly. "That sounds about right." Michael stepped aside, motioning him in. The house smelled faintly of paint and cedar, the air alive with quiet music from somewhere upstairs. The walls were lined with paintings, landscapes mostly, but there was something about them that drew Ethan in. They all seemed to share the same loneliness. "I hope you don't mind a bit of clutter," Michael said, leading him to the guest room. "Artists never do well with order." "I don't mind," Ethan replied. "It feels alive." Michael glanced at him then, surprised by the sincerity in his tone. "That's a rare compliment. Most people just call it messy." They both laughed softly, and the sound filled the silence between them. It felt easy, unexpected. At dinner, the conversation moved slowly, like the rhythm of the waves beyond the glass doors. Michael asked about Ethan's studies, his plans, his life back in the city. Ethan answered politely, carefully. He didn't say how uncertain everything felt since graduation, how he felt like a stranger in his own life. Michael didn't press, but his eyes carried an understanding that felt dangerous in its gentleness. When he spoke about Ethan's father, his tone softened. "Robert was once my closest friend. We used to argue about everything, philosophy, art, even who made the better coffee. He was fierce, in every sense." Ethan nodded. "He still is." Michael smiled wistfully, sipping his wine. "And you? Do you take after him?" "I don't think so," Ethan said quietly. "He's certain about everything. I'm not certain about anything." The words hung in the air like an unplanned confession. Michael didn't respond immediately, but his gaze lingered, thoughtful and steady. It wasn't judgmental, just aware. Ethan found himself wishing he hadn't said so much, yet part of him was relieved he had. Later, as they stood on the veranda, the night spread around them like velvet. The ocean scent mingled with the sharpness of pine. Michael leaned against the railing, the dim light tracing the lines of his face. "Your father told me you were looking for direction," he said. "But maybe it's not direction you need. Maybe it's space to listen to yourself." Ethan didn't know what to say. He looked out over the dark water instead, where the moonlight broke into fragments on the surface. "Sometimes I don't even know what I'm listening for," he murmured. "That's how you know it's important," Michael replied. The air between them shifted then, subtle, weightless, and yet unmistakable. Ethan felt something stir inside him, something unfamiliar and almost alarming. It wasn't attraction in the simple sense, it was recognition. Like two parts of the same silence finding each other, inside, Michael poured them both another glass of wine. His movements were unhurried, deliberate, as though the night had all the time in the world. Ethan watched him, aware of how easily the man carried himself, how his voice softened when he spoke, how even his pauses felt meaningful. When Michael asked about Ethan's art, because Ethan had once mentioned painting in passing, he answered with hesitation. "I used to. Not much anymore." "Why not?" "I don't know," Ethan said. "Maybe I stopped seeing the point." Michael nodded, his expression unreadable. "Art isn't about the point. It's about the truth you're brave enough to face." Ethan looked down at his glass, tracing the rim with his finger. The phrase lingered, heavy in his chest. The truth you're brave enough to face. He wondered if Michael was speaking about painting, or about something else entirely. When the clock struck 10, the conversation faded naturally. Michael showed him to his room, and for a moment, they stood in the doorway facing each other. The silence was calm, not awkward, but filled with something unspoken. "If you need anything," Michael said, "my room's just across the hall." "Thank you," Ethan replied, his voice barely above a whisper. After Michael left, Ethan sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the house breathe. Somewhere, a floorboard creaked. The sea wind rattled the window slightly. He could still smell the faint trace of paint and cedar on his hands that he tried to read, then tried to sleep, but his mind kept returning to Michael's words, the way he spoke, the way he listened. No one ever listened like that, not even his father. When he finally rose to close the window, he caught sight of Michael in the garden below, walking slowly, barefoot, the light from the house outlining him in gold. He paused for a long moment, looking out toward the dark ocean. Ethan watched him, unseen that he didn't know why the sight stirred something inside him, an ache that wasn't quite longing, but close. A wave broke against the rocks, scattering droplets of silver into the air. Michael turned then, almost as if he sensed the gaze, and for a fraction of a second, their eyes met through the glass. Neither moved. Neither spoke. Then Michael gave a small nod, faint but deliberate, and disappeared into the darkness beyond the porch. Ethan closed the window and leaned against the frame, the sound of the waves filling the silence left behind. He told himself it was nothing, that he was tired, that the day had been long. But somewhere beneath that reasoning, something else began to take shape, something he couldn't yet name. By the time he lay down again, the night had deepened into stillness. The sea kept whispering outside, endless and patient, as though waiting for him to understand what it was trying to say, and Ethan, eyes open in the dark, realized that this visit, this quiet, unintended detour, was already beginning to change him in ways he couldn't undo.